All right, welcome to dot point A8 and A9, which we're looking at describing how hormones regulate reproduction and behavior in animals, including testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, prostaglandin, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. So this is quite a complex dot point. It's going to require a bit of time to understand it properly, and it's important here to note that we need to look at reproduction and behavior. So the effect that these hormones have on reproduction and behavior in animals, and it's an including dot point. So you need to know about each of them because you could be asked about them by name in any exam that you do. So first of all, let's start by looking at what a hormone is. A hormone here, this is the definition here, a regulatory substance transmitted in either tissue fluids or blood. And it's basically a signaling molecule. So it's produced by one part of the body. It can be sent to another part of the body to kind of tell certain organs elsewhere to do something. And obviously, different hormones lead to the different things happening in different places in the body, which we're going to look at in a second. So the role of them is to help regulate animal reproduction and behavior. I'm sure you're aware of the effect of testosterone on behavior, but we're going to look at reproduction as well with all of these hormones. So it's produced in glands, or hormones are produced in glands, and they help regulate the physiology and the behavior of distant organs elsewhere in the body. Okay, so from the list of hormones in the syllabus dot point here, we're going to separate them into either male or female, and the only male one is testosterone. I guess in a sense the male is less complicated in terms of hormones and the reproductive system, and the female is a lot more complex. So we have estrogen here, progesterone, basically all of the other ones in the dot point, prostaglandin, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH from now on, and luteinizing hormone, spelt with an I in the middle there, luteinizing hormone, or LH from now on. So all of the rest of them are female hormones. Okay, so we're just going to go through first and look at the effect of each of these hormones on both reproduction and behavior. Some of them don't have a lot of effect on behavior, so we're going to look at where they do have an effect on behavior. If you're going to choose to answer a question, for example, in a paper that asks you to talk about the effect of a hormone on reproduction and behavior, and it maybe asks you to talk about two, the first two are the easiest. So testosterone obviously has a big effect on behavior and reproduction in males, and estrogen is the easiest one to talk about when it comes to behavior in females. So let's look at them individually. So testosterone in males leads to, in terms of reproduction, growth of the sexual organs, such as the testes, etc. And it also helps maintain fertility after maturity and involves sperm production, etc. So if you've had a castrated male, clearly they're not going to be producing much testosterone, and so they're not going to be, obviously also not fertile, and that affects other things as well, but it affects their reproduction clearly, which is usually the reason you do it. And so what testosterone does to behavior is it affects their libido or their sex drive, because clearly it's higher in males that have more testosterone, and the animals that have been castrated will not have a libido. This leads to higher serving capacity, or the number of times it can be mated. And then non-castrated males with higher testosterone are more aggressive and difficult to handle. So testosterone leads to aggressive and difficult behavior, which I'm sure you're aware of. Okay, so female hormones. Let's look at estrogen, which is probably the one most people know of. It's the easiest one to talk about in terms of effect on behavior and reproduction if you get asked a question where you can choose which hormone you talk about. So in terms of reproduction, the estrogen causes further growth of the follicle, which we'll look at in a second, growth of the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus wall for a pregnancy to occur. It inhibits follicle stimulating hormone, so that's important. High estrogen increases luteinizing hormone production, because if there's high estrogen levels, it's likely that there will be a follicle that will come out, a Graafian follicle, and luteinizing hormone is the thing that splits open that follicle and causes ovulation. And then obviously estrogen leads to development of the mammary glands, or the teats, which is obviously important if the animal's going to become pregnant for producing milk. In terms of behavior, estrogen leads to an animal, we're mostly talking about a cow here, but any other animal as well, but it leads to them being on heat and displaying behaviors of being on heat or willing to mate, and that's what happens when there's high estrogen happening. You get what you call chinning behavior, which is the animals wanting to mate, including things like restlessness. They'll be willing to stand for mating. They'll be willing to accept the male, and there'll also be string mucus from the vagina as well from the production of estrogen. If we look at progesterone now, it'd be good to write here. I guess break this word up. So pro means for, and gesterone or gestation means pregnancy. So this is pro-pregnancy, or for pregnancy is another way of putting this hormone. So it makes it easier to remember that progesterone is for pregnancy. So if the animal does get pregnant, the progesterone levels go up each month anyway if the cycle continues and an animal's not pregnant, but it'll drop away if the animal's not pregnant. But if an animal becomes pregnant, the levels of progesterone will stay high for the entire time the animal's pregnant. So in terms of how it affects reproduction, it prepares the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus wall, for the implant of a fertilized egg. So if the animal does become pregnant, the fertilized egg will implant itself in the wall of the uterus, and that is helped out by progesterone. You can see here an image of the uterus from the textbook, and you've got the uterus wall here, which is going to become thickened each month. The lining is going to become thickened, and ultimately at the end of the cycle, if the animal doesn't fall pregnant, the lining of the wall here, or the endometrium, is shed, and obviously you have a discharge of blood that occurs because of that. So progesterone also helps maintain pregnancy. So like we said, pro or for pregnancy, it maintains pregnancy and is produced by the placenta if the egg is fertilized. In terms of behavior, if there's progesterone being produced, the animal won't stand for mating, meaning it won't be willing to mate at this time because it's probably pregnant or is past the point where it can become fertilized. So it will not accept the male at that time. Okay, so these last three, basically the focus of these ones is reproduction. There's not really an behavior example as such. So prostaglandin, this happens if progesterone drops off and the animal is not pregnant, then a hormone called prostaglandin leads to the contraction of the uterus wall. And so as I mentioned a second ago, if the animal is not pregnant, the lining or the endometrium of the uterus wall here will be shed and will be discarded, as it says here, and that's caused by prostaglandin when progesterone drops off. The last two here are to do at the start of the cycle, basically, where you get follicle stimulating hormone, an easy one to remember because it stimulates the production of a follicle, and the follicle's longer name is known as Graafian follicle, and the Graafian follicle itself produces estrogen. And basically, we're going to look in a second, but the follicle that comes out of an ovary contains both the ovum or the egg and the corpus luteum, which we'll look at in a second. So the follicle isn't just the egg. It contains the egg, but it also contains the corpus luteum. And lastly, the luteinizing hormone, and its effect on reproduction is that the luteinizing hormone actually causes ovulation. So if you get asked a question like you might see from a past HSC question shortly, what hormone leads to ovulation? The answer is luteinizing hormone, because this actually triggers the Graafian follicle to rupture and break open, and that leads to the release of an egg. And when that happens, the animal can be fertilized, the egg can be fertilized. So moving on, this is a diagram of the estrus cycle. Now, what I forgot to do here was to write up the top the heading, which would be estrus cycle, and in Australia we spell estrus OESTRUS, estrus cycle, so it'd be good to write that up here. So this is the cycle, and this is assuming that the animal doesn't become pregnant, and it just kind of goes around each month. It takes about 28 days, 24 to 28 days. Basically, for a cow, it's the same as a kind of human in terms of the length of the cycle. And this is a cycle, so this is assuming the cow doesn't get pregnant. Now, if the cow does get pregnant, this cycle stops for a time, and the kind of it goes off on a tangent. And you can see here, I've drawn a little summary on this next page of the cycle. And so you have these hormones happening, and then the estrous cycle just continues on month after month after month, and it just keeps going around like this, unless the animal gets pregnant, in which case it goes off on this tangent, and all these other hormones are produced and used, different ones. If the cycle it just keeps happening, you get these hormones, and it just goes off on this tangent if it becomes pregnant for obviously 9 months or so while the animal is pregnant. So let's have a look quickly at the estrous cycle. So this point here, to give you a reference, is estrus, or this is basically when the ovulation occurs and the egg is, when mating would occur, and the egg is viable and ready to be fertilized. And so this is only one day. You can see here these are days. This is kind of day 12 to 14 of the cycle, day 14 of the cycle, day 15 to 20, and then the rest of the days. And these are the names of the stages. Estrus is when the egg is able to be fertilized. And you'll notice that this point here is really only 24 to 36 hours roughly in a cow when it can actually be fertilized. So it's really only a short period of time that the egg is viable and able to be fertilized. So this is just showing what's going on in terms of hormones at the different stages of the cycle. These are the follicles that are in ovaries. So obviously the cow has 2 ovaries, and as you can see here, the ovaries are here, and these little follicles here are in the ovaries, and follicle stimulating hormone, funnily enough, stimulates the development of the follicle. And you'll get a follicle coming out here, and inside the follicle you have both the egg, also known as the ovum, ovum, and also the corpus luteum. So the follicle contains 2 things, the ovum and the corpus luteum. And this moves along, so you've had this follicle stimulating hormone has gone up, and it's stimulated a follicle to come out of the ovary, and it's kind of heading around this way. And then at that point you have estrogen, which increases, and that obviously modifies the behavior of the cow, because it's getting towards the point here where it's ovulation and where the cow needs to mate to actually get the egg fertilized. So you've got estrogen picking up to let the cow get on heat and changing behavior. And then at this stage, you've already got a follicle, so obviously follicle stimulating hormone can drop off. As you head around into this point where the cow is on heat because of estrogen, you have an increase in luteinizing hormone. And this shows here because you've got the Graafian follicle is now split apart, and you have the ovum, or the egg, and you have the corpus luteum, which is the remnants of the follicle. And this is going to be used later on, which we'll talk about. So luteinizing hormone causes the release of the ovum from the follicle and the growth of the corpus luteum. So here, remember this is a cycle, and assuming it's not getting pregnant here, we have the corpus luteum, and what the corpus luteum does is it produces progesterone and maintains pregnancy if it's pregnant. Remember, progesterone meaning pro-pregnancy, and it prepares the reproductive tract for a potential pregnancy if it does get pregnant. Now, if pregnancy occurs, progesterone is maintained. So progesterone pro-pregnancy continues to keep the pregnancy functioning. And this here is kind of showing what happens if there's no fertilization, there's no pregnancy, and the corpus luteum kind of withers away and dies off. And then what we have happening if there's no pregnancy is progesterone, or the pro-pregnancy hormone, drops off because there is no pregnancy. And at the exact same time, the prostaglandins increase, because the prostaglandins are the things that contract and dissolve the uterus and the corpus luteum and the lining of the uterus wall. So that is shed, and you obviously get a discharge of blood occurring here. And that is because there's no pregnancy. The lining of the uterus wall is clearing itself out thanks to the prostaglandins increasing and the progesterone decreasing. And that means that the cycle is about to start again, and kind of refreshing the uterus for the cycle to start over again. And then obviously we go back into follicle stimulating hormone being increased so that you get another follicle, and this is a whole kind of 24 to 28 days cycle that's occurred here. Then you get chinning behavior and etc. So the signs of estrus here include chinning behavior, the animals kind of getting close to each other and being interested in each other more, the males and the females. They're restless, they stand still for mating, and as mentioned before, stringy mucus from the vagina. So moving down to the next page, this is just a summary that I've kind of done of the previous pages to make it a bit easier, hopefully, to understand, or just a different way. This is not any new information here. So this is what happens. You get hormones 1, 2, and 3 occurring every month in the cycle, and then you get basically both of these happening as well, but progesterone only continues if there's a pregnancy. You get prostaglandin if there's no pregnancy. So this, I've put the numbers of the hormones up here and down here to show you kind of what happens in a cycle. So as I said, the cycle continues here, and then if it gets pregnant, it goes off on this tangent. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates follicle production, number 1. Luteinizing hormone releases the ovum and corpus luteum growth, which happens every month. Third, estrogen modifies behavior on heat to cause the animal to be willing to mate. And then if there is progesterone produced anyway, but if there is no pregnancy, there is prostaglandin, which contracts the uterus and dissolves the lining of the uterus wall, and then it goes back again to follicle stimulating hormone. That's the monthly cycle. Now, if a pregnancy occurs, you get progesterone being maintained for a long time, for the whole length of the pregnancy, because it's pro-pregnancy and keeps the pregnancy going. These 6, 7, and 8 are basically extra hormones, and it's important to note these are not in the dot point, so you're not going to get asked about these by name, but it might be nice to throw it into an answer if you do happen to remember them. They're pretty easy as well, because they generally, the name of them gives away what they do. So prolactin, or for lactation, or for milk production, prolactin initiates and maintains lactation, milk production. Oxytocin allows milk letdown to occur. And then the last one, 8, relaxin, hopefully easy to remember, produced by corpus luteum late in pregnancy to kind of allow birth and birth to occur. So relaxin is the name, hopefully easy to remember. The last point here on the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum, remember, is the part up here that is the Graafian follicle. So we have the ovum and the corpus luteum. This corpus luteum ends up getting implanted into the lining of the uterus wall. So it secretes progesterone if the egg is fertilized, and it helps maintain the thick lining of the wall of the uterus. And the corpus luteum will stop secreting progesterone and decay if it's not pregnant, which leads to the uterine layer falling away and being expelled, which leads to a blood discharge, as we talked about before. And if you introduce prostaglandins into a cow artificially, so let's say the cow became pregnant and the pregnancy kind of went off on this tangent here, so pregnancy is occurring, the fetus is growing. If you introduce prostaglandin, which contracts the uterus and sheds the lining of the uterus wall, if you introduce prostaglandin in here when there's a pregnancy, it can lead to an abortion. So you can cause the cow to lose its pregnancy if you were to, for example, introduce artificial prostaglandins into the animal at that time. Okay, so this is the second dot point in this worksheet. So A9 is this dot point, and what we need to do is explain the interaction between hormones in an animal's estrus cycle. So what it's asking is how 2 or more hormones actually interact with each other. Now there's a few options here. So basically what I wanted you to do here was use the diagram of the estrus cycle, which is here on the right, to choose 2 hormones that appear to interact with each other, i.e. change levels together or apart at the same time, and think about and research why there might be an interaction between 2 of them. So here you've got the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus wall, which increases as the animal might become pregnant. This here is ovulation, and remember we said this is 1 day, or about 24 to 36 hours. this is the follicle here, and the growing follicle, and then you have luteinizing hormone. Funnily enough, luteinizing hormone spikes on the day when ovulation occurs because it splits open the follicle into the corpus luteum and the ovum in the middle. So that's why luteinizing hormone spikes there. Follicle stimulating hormone obviously spikes to cause the follicle to come out of the ovary, and then it drops off. They both drop off at the same time. At the same time, you have estrogen. The Australian spelling is with an O at the start, and the estrogen spikes on the day that the egg or the ovum is released, and luteinizing hormone, because estrogen leads to the cow being on heat and being willing to mate. So that's why that happens on that day, and then it kind of goes up that way and then drops off. And remember, progesterone or pro-pregnancy, which maintains pregnancy, is kind of low here because there's no pregnancy if the cycle's occurring. And then potentially you could get fertilization here on this day, and the progesterone kind of spikes up here as the pregnancy potentially might occur. And if a pregnancy does occur, then the progesterone will simply flatline here and stay high. However, this is a cycle here. This animal hasn't got pregnant and the progesterone is dropping off again, and the cycle is going to start again, and the lining of the uterus wall here is getting shed. Now, as we know from elsewhere, prostaglandins are the one that contract the uterus wall and lead to the discharge and removal of the lining of the uterus wall. So prostaglandins are not listed here, but if we were to put prostaglandins in, they'd kind of flatline here until the point where progesterone drops off, and then you'd have prostaglandins kind of spiking here because they would be clearing out the uterus wall when there's no pregnancy, when progesterone drops off. So there's a number of options here. You could talk about progesterone and prostaglandins. You could talk about estrogen and luteinizing hormone, which is what I did, or you could talk about follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. There's a lot of options, but I chose to talk about estrogen and luteinizing hormone. And so you can see here what I wrote. Estrogen and luteinizing hormone are examples of hormones that interact with each other. So you can see estrogen spikes on the same day that luteinizing hormone spikes. They both spike at the same time, which is at the time of ovulation, which is about 24 to 36 hours, which might be a nice bonus to put in there. When the ovum is released from the follicle, luteinizing hormone causes the rupture of the follicle to release the egg, whilst estrogen causes the cow to be on heat and willing to be mated. This interaction of hormones leads to a viable ovum and fertilization of that ovum potentially occurring on the same day. So hopefully if you do get fertilization, that occurs on the same day. And that's an example of answering that question of how they interact with each other. So that's really what all this dot point is asking. So moving on to past paper questions, we have the first one from last year, from 2016. What is the name of the hormone that promotes development of the lining of the uterus wall in mammals? And the answer is estrogen, which we've already seen. Question here from 2015, outline the influence of testosterone on the behavior of male animals. So testosterone is produced in the testes of whole or entire males, ones that are uncastrated, and it leads to them being aggressive and difficult to handle. It also influences their libido. So I've put enough there to get the 2 marks. 2014, what is the function of the hormone progesterone? And the answer here is it maintains pregnancy. It's pro-pregnancy, and the other ones are not correct. You can see here that there's a question on hormones every year, so you really need to be able to answer questions on hormones. This one's an easy one. Which group of chemicals regulates animal reproduction and behavior? It's none of the other ones except hormones. 2013 as well. Both of these are in the multiple choice section in 2013. Which of the following is responsible for ovulation? And remember, luteinizing hormone is the one that actually breaks apart the follicle and creates a corpus luteum and an ovum. So the one that's responsible for ovulation is actually luteinizing hormone. Okay, so the last couple of questions here, like I said, there's one in every year's paper, sometimes 2. What term is used to describe the time between consecutive ovulations in a breeding female animal? So this is assuming the cycle is just going around and around and around and continuing and not getting pregnant, and that is known as estrous cycle. So breeding cycle is not correct. Standing heat is something different. Gestation period means pregnancy. So it's talking about the cycle continuing and not being pregnant. So the answer is estrous cycle. 2012 as well. Again, what is the name of the hormone that is responsible for maintaining pregnancy? That's hopefully an easy one. Progesterone, pro-pregnancy. And the last question, 2011. Again, we've seen this one before. What group of chemicals is responsible for the regulation of animal reproductive systems? And the only answer there is B, hormones.